Now, I do want to hit on the camera right now because this was probably the biggest asset that this phone had. Besides the software, maybe even the performance, the camera was the thing that was hyped up the most. Now, the Nexus lineup never really had that great of a camera, and this was the, successor to the Nexus lineup. And I think the Nexus 6P was that device that kind of started changing up the opinion of, the Google devices and their cameras. But funny enough, the Nexus 6P was kind of a flop because of the hardware defects that Huawei had. So this device was the successor, and this camera on this device is still extremely good. So 2016, let me just paint out the landscape. That year we had phones like the iPhone 7 Plus, and I think we had the Galaxy S7 as well. And all those phones could only do 4K at 30. The iPhone 7 Plus had that dual camera setup, which I was really happy about. This device does have that single 12.3 megapixel sensor, and you can do 4K at 30 on it. Now, let me put that out there. Right now, in this day and age, 4K at 30 is kind of like the bare minimum for like a budget phone. For this thing being a flagship at the time, it's okay because when you look at the other phones at that time, they could only do 4K at 30 as well. So it's really not that big of a deal. But this camera arguably was the best camera of that year. This and the standard pixel version, those were the best camera phones of that time, and rightfully so. Not only were the sensors pretty decent, but the biggest thing that Google had going for them is their software. Their software enhancements of their photos are always top tier, and because, and there's a reason for it. They pretty much build it into stock Android, so for a lot of their features that they have, I'm pretty sure all these other phones can, use those same things, but sometimes they don't. So with that being said, all those little standard, things that Google puts into their camera UI is pretty much transferred over to all those other stock Android phones as well. And that's a strong thing. Most manufacturers will end up changing it up for their own flavor of whatever, but the software enhancements alone are strong assets for the Android's, development software in general. And this is one of my favorite things about this phone. Now, you do have an 8 megapixel front-facing camera, and again, only 1080p at 30 on the front, no 4K at 60 like we've been having on pretty much every phone since 2019. But again, it's totally okay because at that time in 2016, most phones only could go up to, 1080p at the max. So it's totally okay. I totally understand. For sure, when it comes down to it, the camera setup on this thing gets a thumbs up for me. I think it's a solid camera for sure. So in terms of the camera setup, I'll say, yeah, it's still a really good camera. It's definitely not perfect. And of course, all these other phones are much better, but I still think this camera is pretty good when it comes down to it. Now, moving